Hi, my name is Annie Pollock, and today I'm going to discuss the anatomy of the skull and brain. Just to go over some learning objectives, I am going to discuss the bones of the skull, including facial bones, cranial bones, and bones of the orbit. I will also discuss the anatomy of the brain, including the cerebrum with its 4 lobes, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, and the brainstem. I will also talk about the meninges and the dural folds, as well as blood flow within the brain, including the venous sinuses and the circle of Willis. We're going to start off with the facial bones, which here we can see we have the zygomatic bone, which forms the cheekbones of the face and articulates with the frontal, sphenoid, temporal, and maxilla bones. Then in here, these little bones in blue are known as the lacrimals. These bones are the smallest bones of the face and form part of the medial wall of the orbit. Here we have the nasal bones, which form the bridge of the nose. Next up, we have the inferior nasal concha, which are shown right here, and they are located within the nasal cavity and function to increase the surface area of this cavity. Here in red, we have what's known as the palatine bones. These are situated at the rear of the oral cavity and form part of the hard palate. Then in yellow, right here, we have these bones, which are known as the maxilla. They comprise part of the upper jaw and the hard palate. And this bone in here is known as the vomer. This forms the posterior aspect of the nasal septum. Then down here, this big bone in purple is the mandible. This is also known as the jawbone. Now we'll go over some of the cranial bones. We have here the sphenoid bone, the ethmoid bone, the frontal bone, parietal bone, temporal bone, and occipital bones. These bones are clinically relevant in terms of cranial fractures, typically resulting from blunt force or penetrating trauma. Some common symptoms of these injuries include visible injury or bleeding, with more subtle symptoms including clear fluid drainage from the ears and nose, poor balance and confusion, as well as slurred speech and a stiff neck. As a fun fact, there are certain areas of the skull that are natural points of weakness. One of such areas is known as the pterion, which is shown right here. This H-shaped junction between the temporal, parietal, frontal, and sphenoid bones is actually the thinnest part of the skull and therefore the part that's most vulnerable to injury. A fracture in this area can cause laceration of the middle meningeal artery and ultimately might result in an extradural hematoma. Now I'll go over the bones of the orbit. Some of these bones might look familiar as they were just previously discussed. However, these are the bones that specifically make up the orbit, which is where the eyeball goes. There are 7 bones that make up the orbit, including the frontal bone, shown here in green, lacrimal, these tiny bones discussed before, smallest bones of the face, zygomatic, maxillary, sphenoid, ethmoid, and palatine. If you have trouble remembering the specific bones that make up the orbit, like me, I came up with this mnemonic, and it might be a little bit helpful. It's friendly little zebras must sit, eat, and play. That's F frontal, L lacrimal, Z zygomatic, M maxillary, S sphenoid, E ethmoid, P palatine. Friendly little zebras must sit, eat, and play. To start off with the brain anatomy, we're going to go over the cerebrum. The cerebrum is actually the largest part of the brain, and its external appearance is highly convoluted, characterized by gyri, which are the ridges, and sulci, which are the grooves, which can be seen over here. We have the gyri and the sulci. This outer layer shown here is known as the cerebral cortex, which from class we know is responsible for a bunch of good things such as conscious thought, problem solving, and personality. Basically, the cerebral cortex makes you who you are. The cerebrum is divided into 2 cerebral hemispheres, by the longitudinal fissure. You can't see the longitudinal fissure in this image. However, we can assume that it's located right here to separate the brain into two halves. Internally, these two hemispheres are connected by a structure known as the corpus callosum. Also, the cerebrum can be divided into 4 distinct lobes, which you might recognize are related to the cranial bones that I just discussed. We have the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe, which each perform a physiologically distinct function. Next up, we have the cerebellum, which is the second largest part of the brain. As we can see here on the left in this cadaver image, it is inferior and posterior to the cerebrum. It can be divided into 2 hemispheres, just like the cerebrum, separated by this structure known as the vermis, which can be seen here. From this image, we can also see that the cerebellum is divided into anterior lobes and posterior lobes. Next up, I'll discuss the diencephalon, which is critically important in the brain for regulation of the body and endocrine function. The diencephalon consists of the thalamus, hypothalamus, and pituitary gland, which is connected to the diencephalon via the infundibulum. Over here in this drawing, we can see that the thalamus is superior to the hypothalamus, which is superior to the pituitary gland, that is divided into 2 distinct regions, the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary, which perform physiologically distinct functions. Also to note, in this region, we have the pineal gland. Here on the right is a cadaver image where we can see these structures, the thalamus and the hypothalamus, in more anatomical detail. Next up, I'm going to go over the brainstem, which consists of the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Going from most superior to inferior, we have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. And from class, we know that the medulla is essential for life as it regulates essential functions such as breathing and heart rate. Next up, we have the meninges, which are 3 protective membranes that surround the brain and spinal cord. The outermost layer is known as the dura mater, which translates to hard mother. It is seen right here. And then next we have the arachnoid mater, which is the middle layer, under which we have this subarachnoid space, which is a web-like formation that contains cerebral spinal fluid, and cerebral spinal fluid will flow through this area. Next, the innermost layer is the pia mater, which directly adheres to the brain surface. These meninges are clinically relevant in terms of meningitis, which is a common infection that can result from either bacterial or viral infection, and it is inflammation of the meninges. Dural folds are folds of dura mater that create fissures and separate parts of the brain. As for these dural folds, we have the falx cerebri, which projects from the longitudinal fissure, which can be seen right here. We also have the tentorium cerebelli, which is located between the cerebellum and the cerebrum. Then down here in this inferior posterior aspect, we have the falx cerebelli, which is inferior and posterior to the cerebellum. As for venous drainage, blood will flow out of the brain through venous sinuses. There are 11 venous sinuses in total. Here we can see the superior sagittal sinus, the inferior sagittal sinus, and the straight sagittal sinus, all of which converge at the confluence of sinuses, this structure at the posterior and inferior aspect of the cranium. From there, blood will travel bilaterally through the transverse sinus and then through the sigmoid sinus, ultimately to leave the brain through the internal jugular vein. Finally, we will discuss arterial supply of the brain. Blood supply to the brain is carried out by the vertebral arteries and the internal carotid arteries, which arise from the neck and travel to the cranium. The branches of these arteries form a circular structure known as the circle of Willis, which is located on the inferior surface of the brain. Here we have depicted the circle of Willis, and we can note that the branches of the vertebral arteries include the basilar artery, which is basically a convergence of the two vertebral arteries, and then this vertebral artery will terminate at the posterior cerebral artery, or arteries, which are shown here. As for branches of the internal carotid arteries, they are located proximally to the origin of the middle cerebral arteries, shown here, and the internal carotid artery will terminate at the anterior cerebral arteries, shown here, which are connected by the anterior communicating artery, shown here. Then we have the posterior communicating artery right here, which connects the internal carotid arteries to the posterior cerebral arteries. And that's it for arterial supply to the brain and for the lecture. I hope you learned something about the skull and the brain, and I hope you have a great day.